Lord, once again, it is a pleasure, it's a privilege to be able to share your word this morning. I pray, Lord, that as always, that you would soften the soil. It is always the soil that needs to be worked over. It is never the seed of your word. And so, Lord, work each one of us over in order to receive your seed. And I pray, Lord, that we receive with good grace. I pray that we receive with open hearts and open minds. That we be like the Bereans, Lord. That we receive openly and that we check it against the scriptures. Your word is spirit. Your word is truth. And I pray that you quicken it to us. As always, Lord, any error is mine. All glory, all honour is yours. Amen. Amen. Right, so we're cracking on with the parables. For those of you that aren't regularly with us, we've been teaching through the parables for about the last year and a half, I think, and we're slowly working through this parable. That's so we're now on the talents and the minas 1.1. So this is the second message in the parable of the talents and the minas, and I'm sort of bringing them two together. So the plan is really to try and kill two birds with one stone, make as much headroom as we can, headway as we can rather, with these two parables. Two very similar but different stories. And last week what I did was I kicked off by running them both in tandem together. And from the limited feedback I did get, it appeared to remain at least in part understandable. So if it wasn't, well, you should have told me. And if you didn't tell me, that's your problem, right? So you should have come and had a chat to me and said, it doesn't make any sense. And then I'd have tried to sort it out. But anyway, from what I've heard, most people got it. So my bottom line up front for both these parables was this is about stewardship, right? This is about stewardship. And that's really, really clear from the text and from the way the resource is given and it's handled. But it's not just about stewardship. It's about trying to get us to understand our view of God. Our view of God. And as we explored that, I left you with a couple of questions last week. First of all, are you willing to take risks for God based on your view of God? Are you willing to take risks for God based on your view of God? You know, what is your risk appetite? What is it? Ultimately, what you will or what you won't actually risk comes down to the level of trust that you have in him. That's what it bottoms down to. Because you won't do it if you don't trust him. Because no one in their right mind is going to take a risk on someone or anyone if they don't trust them. The second question that was raised really was, if you're afraid to trust, how well do you really know him? If you're afraid to trust him, how well do you really know him? Now, I don't know about you, but I actually don't like people asking me these sorts of questions. I really don't, because they challenge me. They challenge me. They make me sit back. They make me reflect. They make me think on, where do I stand with that? Where do, really, right in here, where do I stand with that? And often, I actually don't like the position that I find that I stand in. And to be honest, I sometimes wonder just how much am I really willing to risk? How much am I really willing to risk? And then what does that actually say about the faith that I profess? Challenging. You see, it's easy to just sit and listen to someone ask you questions, isn't it? But it's a different matter when you actually take those questions and you actually really think about them and ask yourself them and reflect on them. It's really different. Because then you have to take action. Right? Then you have to take action. So whether any of you from last week have actually pondered any of those questions, I don't know. But I do know that I have. And I recognise that in my own life, there are lots of things that I could probably do better in that area. Lots of things. I'm sure there are. But what I'm grateful of is this, that we are actually on a journey of faith. We're on a journey of faith. We haven't all arrived, okay? We're progressing. We're tracking through. Now, if you're one of those people that are sat there and has arrived, then good on you. Good on you. Well done. What I'd ask you to do is actually get on your knees and pray for the other mere mortals around you who are still on this journey and haven't got to the pinnacle that you've reached. So, we're still trudging on. And if that's you guys, then you're in good company, because I'm trudging on there with you, trust me. Good company. So, to get the old grey matter working again, what we're going to do is we're going to read through the two parable accounts, quite long. I'll put them up on the screen. And we'll read through Matthew, we'll read through Luke. And we're going to use the Matthew account as our baseline. That's where we're going to go to. And then what we'll do is we'll flick into Luke as we sort of track across for any comparison. So I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Matthew 25:14 to 30, we'll kick off with them. It says this: For it will be like a man. So the for it will be like is the kingdom of heaven. For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I've made 5 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master answered, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I've not sown and gather where I've scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, that's the Matthew account. And the Luke account is in Luke 19:12 to 27. So Luke says this: He said, therefore, a nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return. Calling 10 of his servants, he gave them 10 minas and said to them, Engage in business until I come. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, We do not want this man to reign over us. When he returned, having received the kingdom, he ordered these servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. The first came before him, saying, Lord, your mina has made 10 minas more. And he said to him, Well done, good servant, because you have been faithful in a very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities. And the second came, saying, Lord, your mina has made 5 minas. And he said to him, and you are to be over 5 cities. And then another came, saying, Lord, here is your mina, which I kept laid away in a handkerchief. For I was afraid of you, because you are a severe man. You take what you did not deposit, you reap what you did not sow. And he said to him, I will condemn you with your own words, you wicked servant. You knew that I was a severe man, taking what I did not deposit and reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put my money in the bank, and at my coming I might have collected it with interest? And he said to those who stood by, Take the mina from him, give it to the one who has the 10 minas. And they said to him, Lord, he has 10 minas. I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. But as for these enemies of mine, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. So, last week I put up a table this little table that I just pulled together, which gives us like a visual representation of where the parables stack up next to each other. So you could see what the comparisons are in those two accounts. Don't plan to run through all of that again. I went through all of that last week with you. And if I remember rightly, where we'd actually ended up getting up to was verse 18. Matthew 25, verse 18 then. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. You see, this action said something significant, not only about the way the guy handled the resource that he'd been entrusted to him, but it also spoke really loud and clear about what his view of the master was, what his view of his boss was, how he perceived him. You see, all of the servants, they all had the best intention, right? That was to do something right for the master. But how they actually acted with what they were given was determined by the view of who their boss was. You see, having good intentions alone at that point wouldn't have been good enough. Their actions or their inactions were motivated by their view of the boss. Our actions and our inactions will often be motivated by our view of God. How do we see him? The servants in the Matthew story who doubled their master's income were those who were willing to risk it all in the first place. They were willing to risk it all. Their view of their master was such that they knew that even if they lost it all, at least they'd tried. And in trying, the master would have been absolutely delighted with them, pleased with them. They knew that. But that servant that we just read about in verse 18 there, that servant didn't try to do that, did he? He wouldn't risk. And he wouldn't risk because ultimately he didn't trust. His view of the master was different. So the story tracks on, doesn't it, in verse 19. After a long time, the master of those servants comes and settles accounts with them. So the master, he's now back home. He's back home. And as a result of that, what he does, he's now ready to look at what his investments have earned him. He wants to make money, right? And he wants to understand what the investments have earned him. Remember that we're talking about huge sums of money here in real time. This isn't piddly amounts. We're talking about huge sums of money here. Months or even years worth of work in terms of layman's terms, wages. Lots of money. When we flick across into Luke 19:15 reads, when he, that's the nobleman, when the nobleman returned, having received the kingdom, he ordered those servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. So I want to flag something up with you here. I want to ask you a question, so get your thinking caps on. If Jesus is aligning himself to be seen in this story, in this particular bit that we're looking at, who would it be? Do you think? So when he, the nobleman, returned, would Jesus have been aligning himself up with the servants, or do you think he'd have been aligning himself up as being the nobleman, if he were doing that? Yeah, the nobleman. The nobleman who returns after the kingdom, right? And this verse, in many commentaries, most commentaries, presents a view that what Jesus is actually alluding to here is his second coming. When he's going to return to earth after having received authority from the Father. I go away to receive a kingdom. And so when you can see that why people would say this. That 2147 there is that's not a date-setting time, the year 2147 that Jesus is going to return. That's a time on the clock. Just in case any of you looked at that and thought, oh, there's a message there. No, that's just a time on the clock.
It's not a verse.
And it's not a verse or anything like that. No, it's not a chapter and verse. It's just to talk about time. Okay? Anyway, so many commentaries will see this as being, this is alluding to Jesus. He goes away, he receives a kingdom, and then before he begins his reign, what he does is he calls all his servants to him in order to give an account of how they have handled what he has entrusted them. Okay? This wouldn't be those that had lived between Pentecost and what is called the rapture, though. This wouldn't be those group of people. Because based on the rapture, those group of people aren't around. Okay? So that's not what this sits at. Specifically, from reading back the Christian perspective, this would be those believers who were alive mostly during the Old Testament period and during the tribulation period post-rapture. So these are in the commentaries, this is the way that they're viewing that. But there are a number of problems here for us to consider, which you knew there would be, didn't you? There are a number of problems here for us to consider. The mindset giving rise to holding that particular point of view, that particular perspective, would need to be present in those people listening for them to really understand what Jesus was talking about. Now, Jesus was talking in Luke's gospel here, this follows on from talking to Zacchaeus, followed by a big crowd with some of his disciples floating around with him. None of whom had received any insight from the Apostle Paul regarding anything that was spoken about in this book of Thessalonians. There was no insight into that. Paul wrote that in Thessalonians later on down the line. So that was a bit problematic. Then there's the very fact that Christianity didn't even exist then. Christianity's here. Jesus is here. Christianity didn't exist. Nor was Jesus Christian. That's also a bit of another problem. He was a Jewish rabbi. He was not a Christian. It also presupposes a very particular view of the rapture, which is a pre-tribulation, pre-millennial rapture. And this is by no means as clear as many would like you to think it is. And there are very many devout, godly, born-again believers in Messiah Jesus who will hold differing views from you on this. That's okay. People can hold differing views. We are allowed to hold differing views. And remember, if you don't agree with someone, don't set fire to others with your words just because you don't have the same point of view. It does not make you right. It just makes you an arsonist. So don't do it. You're allowed to have a different view about certain things in Christendom. It's not clear-cut. Go back to Snoopy. Remember, you could have got it wrong. And to make that whole thing the focal point of the parable, that second coming, is really actually missing the point. Yes, it features as part of the parable that return journey thing from the nobleman. Yes, it does feature as part. Yes, it's woven into the tale. Absolutely. Yes, it adds colour. Brilliant. Yes, it adds gravitas. But it's not the primary message that Jesus is trying to get across in this parable. And what we do is we do ourselves out of so much richness in Jesus' teaching when we try and force a Christian worldview over here onto the top of a first century Jewish rabbi who was completely steeped in his culture, who was steeped in his traditions, who was steeped in Torah, who was teaching in the rabbinical pattern. We mustn't keep forcing a Christian worldview back over the top of him. I'm going to test you with this, and some of you aren't going to like it, so I'm warning you beforehand. But I'm going to test you with this. You've got a time machine, right? You've got a time machine. And what you do is you decide that you're going to track back to the ancient Near East, and you're going to plan to intersect Jesus as he's tracking on one of those dirty, dusty old roads somewhere. So you're going to try and intersect him. And you've got 3 questions that you're going to ask him. 3 questions. 3 questions. And let's say those things are about things that are pretty common parlance today in our world. Pretty common. These are questions that you'll have all heard, you'll have all had discussions about. Christian churches will have some very strong views on, one way or the other. Polarising questions, but I just warn you now, polarising questions. So, You've gone back in your time machine, you've picked up some dusty desert road somewhere coming out of Jerusalem or coming out of Nazareth, and you intersect Jesus at the corner. You go, Jesus, just the person I've been looking for. I have a question for you. What is your view on Darwin's theory of evolution of the species? It's really important. What is your view, Jesus, on the evolution of the species? That's my first question. My second question, Jesus, is what do you think of folk who actually declare themselves as non-binary? What do you think of folk who declare themselves as non-binary? What's your view on it? My third question, because I've only got three, and I've got to get back in my DeLorean and head back to the year 2021. But what do you think, Jesus, about CERN, the CERN reactor, and what are the next steps for quantum physics? I'd really be interested to hear your views on it, Jesus. What do you think? And I think that Jesus would likely have looked at you and said, I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't understand what you're talking about. Explain what you mean. Probably to every one of those three questions. Now, some of you will be sitting here and will be taking exception to that. Because in your thinking, Jesus knew everything. And so he must have known the answer to those questions. And to even consider that he could have been limited in some way reduces him. But of course he was limited. This was evident by the fact that the God of the universe self-emptied himself to fit into a human body, into this itty-bitty living space. The God of the universe self-emptied himself to do this. There's a theological term for it. It's called kenosis, the self-emptying of God. Can we really grasp that? No, we can't. We can't really fathom what that meant. Paul, when he writes to the church in Philippi, he knows something like this. Philippians 2, 5-7, he says this: have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Try and grasp this thought. God restricted himself to move in temporal space. God restricted himself to move in our timeline, where he, in the person of Jesus, was not everywhere at once. He was not omnipresent. Jesus, in the person of Jesus, was not omnipresent. Jesus was a real man living in Nazareth. He wasn't in multiple places at once, but yet that is a characteristic of God, omnipresence. Jesus was not on his earthly ministry. Where he, God, in the person of Jesus, didn't know everything, because that's omniscience. And Jesus was restricted in his humanity. He didn't know everything. He was a man living in his time, in his culture. Questions that were going to come up 2,000 years later, he wouldn't have understood even the context of, as Jesus the man here. And this is some of the most amazing, intriguing, perplexing, staggering, loving things about the God that we worship. When you actually think about this, it's staggering. Think about the humility involved here. Just think about the humility involved here. You look around today in politics. Look around today in those world leaders who cling to power and will do anything to retain power once they've got it. And you have to peel their fingers off it one by one. You probably have to break their fingers to get many people's grip of power off. You see a leader who steps down at their peak while holding power. You go, what's happened there? How did that happen? Because most people don't do it. It's a bit of a shock. How much more so the God of the universe, the God of everything, being willing to empty himself. You see, far from reducing him, in doing so, what he does is he sets a standard. He sets a standard in Jesus. He sets a standard for our example. God is spirit, right? We cannot grasp spirit. What we can do is we can look at the person of Jesus and go, a man. I can relate to a man. I can see the characteristics of God in that man. Far from reducing him, it should stagger us. Paul says, have this mind among yourselves. I need to be of the same mind. We need to be humble. We need to be obedient. We need to be willing to take the same mind that Christ had, which was to empty himself. These are the characteristics that governed all that Jesus did, all that he said. Humility and obedience. Humility and obedience. We've sidetracked, right? We've sidetracked a little bit off the parable, but hey, it's worth it. I think it's worth it. Even if it's just to get you thinking and asking some of these harder questions. It's worth it. So we get back alongside the parable. It doesn't get much better, though. I'll just warn you. So, if Jesus is actually linking himself with the return of the nobleman, think about the context. Think about the context. We looked at last week, the whole receiving of the kingdom aligns really well to a real-life situation that at least some of those folk would have lived through. The Herodian dynasty, Herod the Great, followed by his son, Herod Archelaus. You see, no one wanted Archelaus, did they? No one wanted Archelaus. They hated him. And he was everything. He was absolutely everything that a bad leader could have been, wrapped up in an itty-bitty living space. He was everything a bad leader could have been. So, if the nobleman equals Archelaus, and if Jesus is lining himself to be seen as the nobleman, who would this equate Jesus with? Archelaus. Oh my goodness. That is absolutely shocking. That is shocking. If the listeners were thinking this, and if Jesus was aligning himself like this would have been a clashing problem in the hearers as they listened to Jesus teach. But you know what it would have done? It would have really made them pay attention. It would have really engaged them, because they would have been stunned. They would have been perplexed, because this would have been something that they were going to really have to grapple with in their understanding. This was a tension that was being laid out in Jesus' storytelling. How could a loving, compassionate, Messiah-like figure, Jesus, even begin to use analogous illustrations linked to a cruel and ruthless leader who was to be feared? It just doesn't work. But in Jewish theology, this was the sort of thing that rabbis just loved to wrestle with. They loved to wrestle with this sort of stuff. The love of God and the fear of God. Questions that perplexed them. But it didn't only perplex them and they just left it as that. What it did was it led them into a deep fascination. It led them into philosophical debate about this dichotomy. Rabbis would choose their disciples not on the answers they gave, but the questions that they asked. Because you can't get to the end of God, right? And so there's so much about God that we can discuss and we can debate and we can chew the fat over. And it should be great. It should be healthy. It's wholesome. Body's made up of many parts. And it's wholesome to have conversations that go backwards and forwards. Well, I don't see it like that. And, well, you see it like that. Well, I don't. How do you see it? Well, I see it like this. Really? Where did you get that idea from? That's just bonkers, man. And somebody else goes, well, no, it wasn't that bonkers. I actually believe it's something similar. And you can have all of this. And this is good stuff. I think it's healthy. It's healthy. In the rabbinic tradition, there was a parable called The Love and Fear of the King's Servant. And what it was done, it was used to illustrate that great Shema passage in Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. I'm not going to go into that whole rabbinical parable, but it's about a king who's got two servants. And each of those servants really equals a type of individual. So individuals are type, and it divides them up into two groups of people, really. You've got the ones who are faithful, and you've got the ones who are lazy. And these two groups of people have two distinct characteristics with them. The faithful, they love and they fear the king. The lazy, well, they don't really love, they just fear. They just fear. And it goes back to that view of, what view do you hold of the master? What view do you hold of the master? Do you love and fear, or do you just fear? Because the one who loved and feared, he did all the right stuff in that parable. He did all the right stuff. He got stuck in, he looked after the gardens, he looked after the orchard, he sorted out all of the fruit, he laid everything out the way the king liked it. The other one who just feared, well, what he did was he looked around him and he just left the land and it became desolate. And in failing to actually sow anything, what he actually did was he reaped the anger of the king. Brad Young, in his book on the parables, sums it up like this. The servant who has the proper faith in God, based upon reverence and love, works diligently to win divine approval through dedicated service. Fear, without love, is not enough. Those who love the king will obey his commandments and seek to please him in their daily lives. And it goes back to the view, how you see God will determine how you are motivated for God. How you see God will determine how you are motivated for God. That Lucan account has the servants, isn't it, being summoned to appear before the nobleman. And they're being summoned in order to demonstrate to him how they have turned his money into profit. How have you done that, guys? And that Greek word earned up there, or earned, is the word gained, highlighted there in the blue. And it refers to profit from engaging in commerce and trade. You'll remember that's the instruction that he gave him before he left, as he goes off. Engage in business. It comes from that Greek root word pragma, which specifically relates to business or commercial transactions. In other words, keep occupied. Make this money that I'm giving you work. Make it go to work. Don't just sit on it. So the expectation was really clear right up front. That's not a bad thing, by the way. That's not a bad thing to try and want money to work. That's not a bad thing. And especially not when we keep right alongside those listeners of the day. The Jewish culture, the Jewish context. In Jewish theology, the concept of faithfulness and reward was just an accepted fact. Faithfulness and reward. It was a given. Faithfulness and reward. There was no discussion about whether that was a prosperity gospel or anything like that. No discussion around that. It was just the way that they viewed it. If you were faithful, you would be rewarded, ipso facto. And of course, the converse applied as well, didn't it? If you are unfaithful, you would also be rewarded, but you might not like that. You might not like that. Go back to Matthew. Matthew 25, 20, 21. So, he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more. Master, you've given me 5, I'll make 5 talents more. His master says, well done, good and faithful servant. I'll enter you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Luke 19:16. First came back saying, Lord, your mina has now made 10 minas. And he says, well done, good servant. Faithful in little, authority over 10 cities. So the first guys in both of these accounts, they come front and centre before the boss. And both of them are rewarded in line with what they've been entrusted with. Remember that the master gave them as much as he knew they could handle. He gave them according to their ability. He gave them as much as he knew they could handle. And both of them made absolutely fantastic returns on that initial deposit. It was amazing. Amazing returns. I'd have been happy with that. Very happy with it. It's truth. In Matthew, the servant gets a verbal commendation, doesn't he? Followed by an increased responsibility. and the ability to enter into the joy of the master. The message renders that like this. The master commended him. Good work. You did your job well. From now on, be my partner. In the Luke account, the servant made 1,000% on his initial deposit. Some return. He'd been entrusted with relatively little, right? But due to the way he handled it, due to the way he stewarded it, he got that money working. He got it working for the benefit of the master. And it all paid off. And his reward was authority over 10 cities. And that authority over 10 cities far outweighed the value of the money that he had originally been invested and entrusted with at the outset. It was the right of a ruler to give someone who had been seen to be faithful authority over much, over areas of the kingdom particularly. Daniel is a really good case in point in this. Daniel 6:3. But Daniel, brimming with spirit and intelligence, so completely outclassed the other vice-regents and governors that the king decided to put him in charge of the whole kingdom. The whole kingdom. So this moves us on in both these accounts, doesn't it? Till we get to Matthew 25:22 and Luke 19:18. Have just a look at that. In the Matthew account that we've got up there, the same verbal commendation is given, isn't it, to that second servant, followed by increased responsibility, followed by the ability to enter into the joy of his master. Exactly the same as for the first servant. He's faithful with little, no matter how little, will see you set over much and see you enter into partnership with the master. But when you look at the Luke response, Luke gives a truncated response to this second servant, doesn't he? He doesn't receive the same amount of verbal commendation for the first one. He still gave a really good return, 500%. Good return. And this is, again, in proportion to the reward that he receives. 5 cities, half as much as the first one. But it's a truncated response. No well dones, just here you go. A question for you here. If you work really hard at work, if you labour really long hours, if you put stacks of time, energy, effort in, the boss comes in, he sees all of this great stuff that you're doing, he comes in and goes, you know what, well done. Well done. You are doing a sterling job. I am going to reward you. Now, if that has ever happened to you, you're likely to be sitting there thinking, well, I would imagine that most of you would be sitting there thinking, woohoo, great. Pay rise? Yes. Promotion? Maybe. Bit of downtime? Maybe a few extra days off. Opportunity to relax. But note what actually happens in the parable. Well done. You have worked so hard. Now I'm going to give you even more responsibility. Which means that you're actually going to need to work even harder. Yeah, great. My dad says to me, hard work is just rewarded with more hard work. Yes. He's absolutely right. At least in my experience, that's the case. So here, the reward isn't the opportunity for you to kick back, turn your toes up, sit in front of the fire while sipping your mocha loca chocolate or whatever it is. Reward here is actually giving you the opportunity for even more service. Even more service. What it's doing is it's actually opening up avenues for you to spend more and more and more of your time in service to the direction, the call and will of the master that you serve. What it isn't is about resting on your laurels, kicking back and enjoying a little bit of self-indulgence, me time, duvet days and all the rest of it. Which may be another reason why that last servant that we're going to look at gets it in the neck. Because by failing to capitalise on what he has been entrusted with, he minimises his future opportunities to serve. But That's going to have to wait until next time I speak. That's going to wait until next time I speak. The question is, what about us? What about us? We are not under law. We are under grace. And with that comes the expectation that we will carry out the ministry that has been entrusted to us. My job is to equip you for ministry. I don't have the ministry. You have the ministry. My job is to equip you for the ministry. What is the ministry that has been entrusted to you? I like the way John Stott deals with this whole sort of grace law thing, because again, that's one of those questions that can be banged around for ages, right? It's great. John Stott says this: is the law still binding upon the Christian? The answer to that is no and yes. No, in the sense that our acceptance before God does not depend on it. Yes, in the sense that our new life is still a bondage. We still serve. We're still slaves, although discharged from the law. But the motive and the means for our service have altered. Why do we serve? Not because obedience to the law leads to salvation, but because salvation leads to obedience to the law. The law says, do this and you'll live. The gospel says, you live, so do this. The motive has changed. The motive has changed. And if you think back to the previous parable, the wise and foolish virgins, the key takings of that: don't be complacent. Prepare. Take on board teaching, Torah. Take on board teaching. Feed it into your life, just like the virgins that were wise did. Because as you allow more and more of that teaching to influence every facet of your living, the greater the reward will manifest in opportunities for service. Love God, love others, serve the world. Encapsulated in that lovely little tikkun olam. Serve the world, repair the world. The more we serve Jesus, the reward will manifest with more and more and more opportunities to serve Jesus. To serve him in our families. To serve him in our communities. To serve him in our place of work. Even, heaven forbid, to serve him through our local church. And actually bring to his service the gifts that he's entrusted us with. We need to remember that we must be a people of the here and the now. A people who are engaged with the world around us today. Not a people who think that we've got our ticket, it's been clipped, and we're just on a journey waiting to ride, heaven when I die type of thing. Each one of us, while we have breath, we still have a job to do in his service. In his service. So, bless you, church. Go well. Honour him. Honour him in your living. Make him front. Make him centre. And allow him to overflow from your life so that you can touch the lives of those around you. And in doing so, you will serve this world. You will. Let's just pray. Lord, each one of us are the products of our upbringing, our culture, and the things that have been inputted into us. None of us have the full understanding of who you are. Because none of us can contain the knowledge of Almighty God El Shaddai. None of us. But we can look on you in the person of Jesus. And we can see the example that we're to follow. And I pray that each one of us would do so. And in doing so, Lord, that we would allow you to infuse us with the power of your Holy Spirit. So that what would flow from us would flow into and touch other lives around us, Lord. May we do more than just fear you. May we demonstrate our love for you in our service to you. We thank you that you have led the way, Lord. You've led the way. You've shown us what it looks like. And as your followers, may we be covered by your dust. I pray for your blessing on the folk that are here today, Lord. And I pray that they would wear you well. In your name we pray. Amen.